Hi, everybody. So this week we are talking about American imperialism, and I'll have to ask you guys to all bear with me. I have a little bit of a cold, so hopefully I won't. That won't be too much of a problem with the lecture this week. But like I said, we're talking about American imperialism, and for the purposes of our lecture this week, the big questions that we're going to be asking ourselves are: what events, ideas, and interests motivated the U.S. to create an empire in the late 19th century? And how did the emergence of an American empire spark a debate over the relationship between democracy, race, citizenship, and freedom? So we're going to be looking first at what things kind of come together, the factors that come together to motivate the U.S. to create an empire in the late 19th century. So what we've been talking about so far in the course is largely the Second Industrial Revolution. We've been looking at the new inventions, new techniques, new consumer goods that were being developed during this era, new transportation technologies. And so for a lot of this, it's really economic reasons that drive American expansion. The Second Industrial Revolution is really the main catalyst for this expansionary outlook to begin to kind of come forward. So with the increased production of manufactured and agricultural goods, the U.S. needed to find markets to sell these goods. There was so much being produced that it could not possibly be consumed all at home. And so we needed to find places to sell our products. There was also a lot of economic uncertainty in the late 19th century. This was a period in which this transition to the industrial economy created an enormous amount of economic instability. And so the late 19th century was marked by periods of economic depression, especially between 1873 to 1879 and 1893 to 1897. Now, these depressions were much more severe than the economic downturns that had occurred in the United States before the Civil War. During the years of expansion, manufacturers flooded the market with goods. And so it created this pattern where once the market was flooded with goods, prices began to fall. There was a lot of competition between producers, and this encouraged them to produce even more, to overproduce. So when the market finally becomes saturated, sales and profits begin to decline, the economy then spirals downward, and production slows, workers are laid off, farm prices are plummeting. Eventually, things end up bottoming out and the economy starts to go back up again. But meanwhile, there's a lot of deprivation and hardship. So people really feared during this period for the future of American capitalism. Now, it's unclear how real this threat of overproduction really was, but it seemed real to people at the time. And so many people began to look to expand America's foreign trade to alleviate this problem of overproduction. And so in order to do that, America needed to kind of project its power outward. While you had these cycles of boom and bust, this economic expansion that leads to overproduction and then it leads to economic downturn. While all this is going on, you see that American exports and foreign investment are increasing dramatically. In 1895, American exports were valued at about $800 million. By 1914, they were valued at $2.3 billion, an increase of nearly 240%. And a lot of this is made possible because of the creation of an extensive transportation network, because of technological advances, because of aggressive marketing techniques, and also because of scientific innovation. Technological advances were especially important for things like agricultural production and exportation. Until 1914, you see that the agricultural sector generates over half of America's total exports. So you have things like improved machinery, scientific advances in things like irrigation, crop management, food processing. All of these things increase agricultural production. So by the early part of the 20th century, nearly 20% of America's total agricultural production is being exported overseas. And as production increases, increases, you start to get oversupply. This depresses prices. So farmers begin to support the idea of opening up new foreign markets. We saw last week about how farmers embrace this idea of populism. Many farmers also embrace the idea of opening up foreign markets and trade. You also see exports of manufactured goods beginning to overtake agriculture. You have mass production, mass marketing techniques that are pioneered by American industrialists and these are also exported along with the goods. In 1898, Senator Albert Beveridge, he was one of the most prominent supporters of America's empire, he said that American factories are making more than the American people can use. American soil is producing more than they can consume. Fate has written our policy for us. The trade of the world must and shall be ours. And so he's linking mass production, mass marketing, and technological improvement to this kind of democratic spirit, to this idea of, sort of exporting America's, not only in democracy, but America's economy around the world. You also see foreign investment beginning to increase. From 1897 to 1914, American investments abroad quadrupled from $634 million to $2.6 billion. And you see this acceleration of direct investment by Americans abroad during the 1890s. And this ends up actually forming the basis for many of today's huge international corporations. You start to see all these mergers and new forms of corporate organization. These corporations are trying to vertically integrate. They need to figure out a way to get around tariffs. They need to move closer to their raw materials or to markets. And this also fuels growth in foreign investment. You start to see corporate mergers accelerating after the 1890s. And things like Standard Oil, the railroad trust, they are gaining power. They're perfecting these new managerial techniques. And so to reap the benefits of that idea of vertical integration, these large corporations often become direct investors in goods that they traded. And so we start to see the firms also integrate the sources of the raw materials, many of them coming from abroad, into their corporation. So they start to buy up land, they start to buy up, oil, they start to buy up all these things that they need, the resources that they need to fuel their production at home. You also have, this is a period when you have very high tariffs. So this forces American exporters to either produce goods within a restricted market or to face being excluded. And so they decide to eventually, sort of take their manufacturing abroad, to move it overseas, so that reduces their shipping costs. These exporters and investors, they believed that they were not just promoting economic progress, they also believed they were promoting social and political progress as well. They saw their activities abroad as modernizing. The Secretary of State under Roosevelt, a guy named Elihu Root, he said, "Our surplus energy is beginning to look beyond our own borders throughout the world to find opportunity for the profitable use of our surplus capital, foreign markets for our manufacturers, foreign mines to be developed, foreign bridges and railroads and public works to be built, foreign rivers to be turned into electric power and light." Another example, a railroad executive speaking at the World's Fair said, "We blow the whistle that is heard around the world, and all peoples stop to heed and welcome it. Its resonance is the diplomacy of peace. The locomotive bell is the true Liberty Bell, proclaiming commercial freedom. Its boilers and the reservoirs are the forces of civilization. Its wheels are the wheels of progress, and its headlight is the illumination of dark countries." So as you can see, these people who were promoting American investment and American exporting of its goods, they really see themselves as kind of bringing American civilization to the rest of the world. It's not just economic, it's also ideological. Now, we have this new economy developing, this new industrial economy. This, as we've seen, also meant new social problems. You have rapid urban expansion. You have the shift to steam power really favoring urban locations for manufacturing plants. And so by 1870, 25% of Americans are living in cities. By 1900, 40% are living in cities. You have the swelling of the urban population. This also comes in part from immigration. So many people are coming from the farms to work in these cities. Also, you have, sort of cities becoming more crowded. You have changing patterns of urban geography. The poorest residents of the city tended to be crowded together in the center, in these slums and tenements. And you started to see the more wealthy residents moving outward to the suburbs, these middle and upper class residential areas. So, as we've seen, the slums were crowded, they were unsanitary, tenement housing was really, really a very difficult place to live. You also have the changing nature of work during this era. You have the mechanization of labor, the mass production of goods. This means that more Americans are becoming wage earners rather than skilled, independent artisans. And this work was very unhealthy. It was dangerous. The workday was really long. You worked 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. There was very little enforcement of what labor laws were on the books. Employers were not very concerned at this point with their employees' health or safety, and they had very little legal responsibility for it. And not only that, jobs were increasingly specialized and monotonous. It was not a very, sort of fulfilling place to work. So you've got these industrialists, these business tycoons like Carnegie and Rockefeller and Morgan. They are accumulating these huge fortunes. The vast majority of American workers are struggling. Even though workers' wages might be going up, the share of the total wealth did not end up increasing. And so we start to see industrialization leading to a rise in class consciousness and trade union militancy. Workers and employers are increasingly engaged in a struggle over who is going to control the workplace. And you start to see thousands of strikes breaking out all over the country. And you have, sort of all of these unions starting to develop, local unions and also national unions at this point. They played a very important role in organizing these protests. Why is all of this important for American foreign policy? Well, those who are making policy also are seeing these social and economic changes, and their decisions are colored by their reactions to those changes. In 1893, as we've seen, the influential historian Frederick Jackson Turner, he wrote that the dominant fact in American life has been expansion. Turner's frontier thesis expressed the sentiments of many white and middle and upper class Americans who believed in this idea of American exceptionalism. They saw themselves, America had defined itself as an expansionist people. Now that the frontier has closed, where would they go from here? You start to see these economic depressions combined with this rise of class conflict and militancy. Many middle and upper class Americans begin to become afraid that the American system could not survive without expansion. You have this rise in population due to increased immigration. This concerns many Americans. Where would all of these people fit? You can see that in this cartoon here, which is expressing sort of this idea of these waves of immigrants washing up on American shores, posing a danger to America's ideas and institutions. And how are we going to incorporate these people? And they are looking at Europe, and they're seeing the problems of Europe: overcrowding, increasingly radical politics. They're seeing this with alarm. They're concerned that these new immigrants are less easily absorbed than older immigrant populations, that they are holding beliefs that might be radical, socialist, even communist, anarchist beliefs. And there's also a racial component to this as well. Many Americans, white Americans, feared this decline of the so-called racial stock with this influx of these new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. Many of these immigrants were Catholic or Jewish, so they were not Protestant. And so you have this, sort of concerns and threats to white Anglo-Saxon Protestant America. So rather than becoming isolationist, many white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Americans believe that a more homogeneous Protestant Anglo-Saxon America could best fulfill its global destiny. And they were very fearful of this social and economic threat that was posed by this increasing immigrant population. So you start to see, as we've talked about, efforts to restrict immigration during this period. But kind of on the flip side of that, seemingly in contradiction to those efforts, Americans also begin to look beyond their own borders during this period. And so this question of why do you think that rather than turn inward and shut the door behind us, many people began to argue that we should venture outward. Why is this the case? Well, it was thought that foreign expansion would help to alleviate some of those social stresses caused by an increasing population, caused by this new industrialization. The idea that, we've closed the frontier, so there's nowhere left for us to go on the American continent. Now we can begin to look beyond the geographic borders of America to go to the other parts of the world and see that as being kind of the new frontier. And there's also the idea that we are going to make the world more civilized, more like us. So this is the idea of, sort of defining civilization as being, sort of coinciding with, sort of what people think of as, sort of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant America. So these are the sort of ideas that we're dealing with this week. So white Anglo-Saxon, one of the ways that white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Americans respond is by venturing outward and by directly attempting to convert foreigners to Christianity and to the American so-called way of life. And so we see this increase in missionary efforts during this period. And this is kind of the cultural counterpart to America's economic expansion. We've already talked about how American investments and American exports are growing during this period. We also see missionaries kind of, exporting American culture. And these missionaries tended to concentrate primarily on Asia, particularly China. Also, they went to Africa. Some of them went to the Middle East. And this was many Americans, this was their first substantial personal contact with people from other countries. And so they are mixing this idea of stewardship with their evangelical impulses. So they very much believed in this idea of Anglo-Saxon superiority, but they were very optimistic. They believed and were convinced that they could civilize the so-called backward people of the world. And so they had this view of kind of this parent-child relationship, that they were, sort of going to convert these backward peoples, and they would become kind of dependent on them, but also there was the possibility of eventual self-sufficiency. So if you've ever read the Rudyard Kipling poem, The White Man's Burden, it's a very influential piece of writing during this period, and it really kind of symbolizes and epitomizes this worldview of the missionaries. They believed it was their duty to go out and to civilize these parts of the world. The first missionaries go out, they don't have a lot of cultural sensitivity. I mean, their attitude was basically, why should they learn the values of this so-called heathen culture that would shortly be transformed? And so this leads to, a lot of, kind of problems for them. They don't have a lot of success with this early kind of approach. So this forces them to reassess their tactics. And they begin to spread Christianity as part of a broader westernizing influence. And this becomes very attractive to many younger converts. So we start to see demand for education in Western languages, English. They start to see demand for scientific education growing in some of these places around the world. And so missionary schools are the ones that respond to that. And this has some unexpected results. It's generally assumed that these American missionary efforts helped Americans to gain friends abroad. It promoted kind of greater cultural understanding, and they were trying to kind of shape the world in America's image. But some foreigners, as we're going to see, react against Americanization by turning more towards traditional ways and traditional religions. We see this in China with the Boxer Uprising. It was thought that these activities would help to enlighten Americans about different parts of the world. But what ends up happening is basically it promotes this idea of, sort of the white savior coming in. And it ends up trivializing other societies and cultures to a great extent. Now, these missionaries were interestingly very much linked to economic expansion. Most of the missionaries ended up settling in port cities. They had their greatest success in converting foreigners who were employed by or who were trading with American businesses. And missionaries themselves even claimed that their missionary work opened up new markets abroad. They also end up receiving donations from very wealthy businessmen to further their efforts. So there's a definite connection between economics and religion going on here. This photo on the left is a picture that was taken in 1891 of missionaries who have dressed themselves in traditional Chinese clothing. And this is kind of an example of how the missionaries, after their kind of initial efforts to convert people abroad, they end up kind of being a little more open and embracing some of the kind of traditional culture a little bit. And this here on the right is a cover of a brochure from the American Missionary Association, which is dated to 1880. And it's a little hard to read, but the banner that's in the middle there, amid those photographs or those drawings of different people, it says, "They are rising, all are rising, the black and white together." So I think this says a lot about American missionary attitudes toward their goal. It sort of depicts the missionaries' belief that their project would benefit both Americans and foreigners. And you can see that in the drawings of the different people on this cover. They have, sort of civilized these foreign peoples. Now, government definitely has a role to play here, too. Expansion is carried out by private citizens and private interests like the missionaries, but the role of government plays is also very interesting. And the U.S. government in the late 19th century developed a lot of techniques to assist American citizens who were operating abroad. The U.S. government is promoting economic and cultural expansion. And so the sort of idea that, private groups would help to enhance the nation's strategic and economic position, and the government is just kind of trying to facilitate that. And so you see that here policymakers and businessmen are really convinced of the need for expansion to avoid overproduction, to maintain America's prosperity and social cohesion. And they also very much believe in this idea of the superiority of the Anglo-Saxon race, and they use government power to maintain that superiority. And so in the late 19th century, you see government power being used to crush all kinds of threatening non-white ethnic groups. So you have, sort of the Native American Wars in the Great Plains. The last great Native American resistance is quashed in the Battle of Wounded Knee in 1890. You have Southern state governments beginning to enforce the ideas of Jim Crow apartheid against African Americans. You have the Supreme Court declaring that separate but equal is okay in Plessy versus Ferguson. You have, in the North, you have government power clashing with strikers, clashing with labor unions, and as many of them filled with these kind of, new immigrant populations. In the West, you have immigration restriction laws passed against the Chinese. And so these ideas about America's racial mission, which were very well rehearsed at home, are very easily transferred overseas. Theodore Roosevelt, who was a very ardent expansionist, as we're going to see, he argued that when the U.S. government fought wars with, quote, barbarous or semi-barbarous peoples, that we were not violating the peace, but rather we were exercising a most regrettable but necessary international police duty, which must be performed for the sake of the welfare of mankind. You can also see this in this quote here by Albert Beveridge. He said, "God has made us adept in government, that we may administer government among savage and senile peoples." And so this is the idea of, sort of, how are we going to promote this American civilization? It's the question of whether we should promote expansion by domination or by peaceful kind of diplomatic efforts. And there's, profound differences among Americans about how to spread its civilization. Some believed that only force could bring these so-called backward nations into civilization. Other people sought to conquer the world peacefully through exporting America's culture, its education, its commerce. Most Americans agree that they don't want to become a traditional colonial power like Great Britain. We don't want to jeopardize our national values. We are reluctant to incorporate so-called inferior people into the American fold. And so America kind of finds its way toward the creation of a different kind of empire, not through colonization, but through protectorates, through economic treaties. We start to see businesses and voluntary associations spreading America's economic and cultural dominance, and the government is assisting them in those efforts. One of the ways that the government assisted was by expanding its military. And this is a picture here of Alfred Thayer Mahan, who wrote a very influential book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. Mahan associated great national power with naval supremacy. And in his book, he kind of fuses these expansionist impulses of Protestant evangelism, this idea of the Anglo-Saxon destiny, this idea that, overproduction is going to cause problems for the American economy, and, the American confidence in its commercial supremacy. And so he kind of fuses all these elements together, and he says the key to all of this is controlling the seas. And so he advocates America going after and taking, and basically acquiring colonies in the Caribbean and the Pacific. And he was also very much in support of an idea of a canal linking the Atlantic and the Pacific. And as we're going to see, that eventually ends up being built. So in the 1890s, the U.S. government starts to construct more and more of a naval force, starts to build battleships, and gradually builds up its naval capacity to match its growing economic power. By 1910, the American naval budget is up to $181 million. And so this new naval power means that we have both the means and the motive to acquire foreign territories. And so we need routes and places to send these new ships. And so we really begin looking to islands, places like Hawaii and the islands of the South Pacific, as places where we can use them as coaling stations, places to refuel, and also places that we can control and export our products as well. And so an example of this is Hawaii. I'm going to talk for a little bit about what happens with Hawaii, because it's a really interesting story. American kind of influence in Hawaii starts really early in the 19th century. American missionaries arrive in Hawaii after 1819, and what they find there is land that was owned kind of in a feudal system with a king as the head. And so it's this kind of feudal government system where you have the king and then you have all of the commoners, and land is kind of, owned in that way. So what the missionaries do is they end up converting the Hawaiian rulers to Christianity, and they become translators and advisors to the kings of the various kings in Hawaii. And they end up, and through that, kind of converting a lot of the native Hawaiian people. Now, of course, this leads to the detriment of the native Hawaiian religion and culture, because once they've converted, then they kind of, abandon their traditional ways. The missionaries introduce European and American ideas about property ownership. And the result of this is that foreigners, as we've seen, along with missionaries come economic expansion. Foreigners begin to acquire large amounts of land in Hawaii, and they realize that they can make huge profits on that land growing sugar and tropical fruits. And so by 1892, Americans and Europeans own about 2/3 of the land on the islands of Hawaii. In 1879, the first sugar plantation was started. And these sugar plantations brought jobs. They brought migrant workers from really all over the Pacific area, from the Philippines, from Japan, even from places like Portugal. And so what we see here is the growth in these sugar plantations really destroys a lot of the native Hawaiian cultural sites. And it also contributes to kind of a new culture growing up, this kind of cultural amalgamation, because you have people coming in from Japan, from the Philippines, from Portugal, and they kind of create this new Hawaiian culture. For example, it was Portuguese workers who brought the ukulele to Hawaii. So between 1879 and 1885, sugar production just increases hugely. It goes up from 1.3 million in 1879 to 8.4 million by 1885. And these plantations just triple in number. In just a single year, 1879 to 1880, you see this explosion of these plantations. And so American corporations or these plantation owners are beginning to argue that, well, we want to be annexed by America before these native rulers can start causing problems for us. So in 1887, the planters demand that the Hawaiian king sign a new constitution, turning over de facto control of Hawaii to the white landholders. And this works for a little while, but in 1890, the annexationists end up losing control of government. And by 1891, anti-American forces end up putting a woman named Queen Liliuokalani on the throne. And she had, according to one U.S. diplomat, extreme notions of sovereign authority. Now, she was the queen of Hawaii, so I think her notions of sovereign authority were pretty much justified, but this was not to the liking of the annexationists, the people who were arguing for annexation, who were, mainly the plantation owners. So she comes to the throne after her brother dies in 1891, and she is very much interested in preserving Hawaii for its native residents. And the queen and these plantation owners struggle for power until 1893, when she issues a new constitution which greatly expands her power. And this overreach causes the annexationists to try to assume control of the Hawaiian Islands with the help of the American Navy. So in January of 1893, the annexationists seize power. A guy named James Blount, the newly appointed American minister to Hawaii, he's representing President Grover Cleveland. And he listens to both sides, the annexationists and the people who want to restore Queen Liliuokalani. And he concludes, well, the Hawaiian people, they have aligned themselves with the queen. They're on the side of the queen. And so the president and his minister, they argue, well, the queen should be restored. Then Cleveland appoints a new minister, and so he comes and he says, okay, we'll give power back to the queen on the condition that she pardon and grant amnesty to those who dethroned her. And so she eventually sort of accedes to this. But eventually, the annexationists, they begin to lobby Congress against the restoration of the monarchy. And on July 4th, 1894, they declare the Republic of Hawaii as existing. And a guy named Sanford B. Dole is proclaimed its president. That's Dole as in Dole pineapple. And this new, republic is, immediately recognized by the United States government. In 1895, Queen Liliuokalani is arrested. She is forced under house arrest in her palace after a cache of weapons is found in the gardens of her home. And she denied knowing anything about this cache. She was reportedly unaware of people's efforts to restore her to the throne. In 1896, she was eventually released. She returned back to her home where she lived for the next couple of decades. And so she has this kind of tragic history here. Now, there's this national debate now. We've recognized this Republic of Hawaii, but there's this national debate over whether we're going to annex Hawaii. And, sort of there's a lot of, sort of question about whether we should do that. But after 1898, the climate has become a bit more favorable to the idea of annexing Hawaii. And so after 1898, the annexation of Hawaii is finally approved. So that brings us to the Spanish-American War. And really, this is the thing that kind of launches the United States as a world power in the late 19th century. So how do we get to war with Spain? Sorry about that. Colds are no fun. All right, so how do we go to war with Spain? Well, so Spain, at this point, had a very mighty empire once upon a time in the Caribbean and in South America, but by the late 19th century, it is almost gone. And so really the only kind of major last outpost is the island of Cuba. And the Cuban people had been struggling against the Spanish, been struggling against being, exploited for their labor on their sugar plantations, and they really were trying to gain their independence. And there were a number of uprisings in the late 19th century where they tried to gain their independence. Now, this raises a lot of tensions between the Spanish and the U.S. And Cuba is, only 90 miles away from Florida, so it's an object of very intense American interest at this point. And again, we see in 1895, the Cuban revolt flares up again. The Spanish government responds to this new wave of, calls for independence by sending a guy named General Weyler, whose nickname was the Butcher, with a number of troops to put down this revolt. And Weyler begins putting these Cubans in reconcentration camps. So he rounds all of these, sort of Cuban people up. He's putting them in concentration camps. Americans are outraged at this. And you start to see all of these sensationalist newspapers in the United States, who are all competing for readership. They start to print these horrifying stories of atrocities being committed by the Spanish against the Cuban people. And so they're really appealing to kind of this idealism, America seeing itself as the protector of the weak, the defender of the right to self-determination. Americans who are motivated by humanitarian concerns, they begin to hold rallies calling, raising money and food for the Cuban people. They call for reforms. Now we also have some self-interest here. American companies are very heavily invested in Cuban sugar plantations. And by 1897, trade was about $27 million per year. So the United States really wanted to ensure a stable environment for its investments. They wanted to protect American sugar fields. So what we see is, sort of this kind of twin concerns here. We have humanitarian concerns on the one hand. We are outraged at the Spanish treatment of the Cubans, but we also want to take advantage of the resources and the strategic location of this island and also increase America's trade. Now, contrary to popular myth, the president at the time, President McKinley, he did not want to go to war with Cuba. He resisted the pressure for war as long as he could, but he wasn't fully in control of all of the events. The Spanish were ruling the Cuban people very autocratically. The Cubans were, wanting to be independent from the Spanish. McKinley said in his inaugural address, "We want no wars of conquest. We must avoid the temptation of territorial aggression." And he comes into office and he's primarily interested in restoring the U.S. economy, which had sunk back into depression at that point. So throughout 1897, McKinley, he's trying to get Spain to end this revolt. And Spain eventually calls Weyler back. And he says, okay, we'll, sort of see if we can give you, the Cuban people, autonomy. But the Cuban rebels reject this idea. They don't find it, that it goes far enough. So in early 1898, you start to see more violence happening, and McKinley assumes that Spain can no longer maintain order in Cuba. And so he sends the battleship Maine, to Havana Harbor. Now, ostensibly, the Maine is sent there on a goodwill mission, but in reality, it's sent there to protect American citizens and property in Cuba. And this leads us to this infamous, event, the explosion on the battleship Maine. And this is an artist rendering of the explosion that sank the battleship. And so on February 15th, 1898, there was an explosion. The ship blew up. 266 men are killed. It wasn't entirely clear what had caused the explosion. And a U.S. commission who went to investigate, they reported about a month later that the explosion had occurred outside the ship. And people thought, well, maybe it was a mine, but they didn't say whether or not it was the Spanish who did it. In 1983, about 80 years later, there was another investigation conducted, and it concluded that the explosion had occurred inside the ship. It was probably accidental. It was, basically, it was a, mechanical failure. And so it was probably not the Spanish after all. But at the time, everybody thought it was the Spanish. And so there was a lot of speculation and a lot of outcry. And this is where we get the famous slogan, "Remember the Maine," becomes kind of the big slogan of the war. Now, the ship sinking inflames people who are advocating for going to war. And you see all these newspapers start to print these, sort of horrific, sort of accounts of this explosion. These newspapers are practicing so-called yellow journalism. Mainly William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal, which you can see here on the left, and Joseph Pulitzer's New York World on the right. They offered rewards for the discovery of whoever had done this. They come up with this enduring slogan, "Remember the Maine," and they, of course, leap to the conclusion that the Maine was sunk by the Spanish, that the Spanish sabotaged the ship. And so they are calling for an immediate response. They're saying we need to go to war against the Spanish. McKinley, on the other hand, he is really trying to kind of keep the U.S. out of war. He refuses to read these sensationalist newspapers. And the press had been demanding war since 1895, and they so far had not been able to, get McKinley to go to war. But stories like this did not help to pacify those who were calling for war, and it gradually helps to shape Americans' public opinion about this. And we start to see all this pro-war propaganda coming out, which you can see in these cartoons here. This one here is kind of an interesting one. It's from a Hearst newspaper, and it's making the claim that the Spanish authorities are strip searching women on American ships, that they're looking for intelligence. And obviously, this kind of a claim would be very inflammatory to Americans. It's the idea that these Spanish men are, sort of violating pure, innocent American women, that they are, sort of humiliating them. You have here this one at the bottom. This is a cartoon depicting General Weyler as a criminal in jail. And the caption reads, "He may serve his country still further," obviously saying that, sort of Weyler is, a criminal. He should be imprisoned. And this here is another pro-war cartoon. You have Uncle Sam there. He's meant to represent the American people, and he's ready to leap to poor defenseless Cuba's rescue from this Spanish vulture over here. But McKinley over here is holding him back. And the headline reads, "Let go of him, McKinley." And I think it's interesting here how Cuba is depicted. And I think you see very often Cuba being depicted in these cartoons, in this pro-war propaganda, as a defenseless feminine figure. And so there's definitely kind of gender ideas going on here, mixing with American foreign policy. So some in the United States were ready to capitalize on this impending conflict with Spain. After the Maine was sunk, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Teddy Roosevelt, he sends a message to Commodore Dewey, who is the commander of the Pacific Fleet. He orders him to load his ships with coal and sail to the Philippines in the event that there's war with Spain. Roosevelt had been urging his boss, the Secretary of the Navy, for over a year to formulate plans for attacking the Philippines. Roosevelt is very much wanting to enlarge the Navy. He's very much in favor of asserting U.S. power abroad, and so he sees this as kind of his golden opportunity. So we start to see public outcry over the Maine, over these, sort of atrocities, the so-called atrocities going on in Cuba, drowning out McKinley's efforts to avoid war. And the issue becomes very highly political. There are midterm elections coming up. There's a presidential election happening in a couple of years. And so in March of 1898, at McKinley's request, the Spanish agree to stop fighting the rebels, and they close those concentration camps, but they refuse to negotiate with the rebels, and they reserve the right to start the hostilities again at any time. And so the public in Congress is really unhappy with this. Finally, in April of 1898, McKinley sends a very carefully worded message to Congress. Basically here he's saying, okay, if you want to declare war, absolutely, fine. I'll support that. Congress debates for 2 weeks, not whether to declare war, but whether to recognize Cuba as independent. And what they end up kind of coming up with is this kind of compromise position, which says that the United States disclaims any disposition or intention to exercise control over Cuba, except for the pacification thereof. And McKinley has no intention of annexing Cuba, so he agrees to this. So, we are now decided we're going to war with Spain. And the Secretary of State at the time, a guy named John Hay, he calls the 3-month conflict in Cuba a splendid little war. And you can see that kind of sentiment being depicted here in this painting, this very famous painting by Frederick Remington of Teddy Roosevelt there. You can see him on the horse leading his Rough Riders up San Juan Hill. Roosevelt promptly, he's the Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the time, he promptly resigns his post, and he gets prepared to lead a cavalry unit, the Rough Riders, into the war. And Americans flock to enlist, including several all-male colleges who just go ahead and volunteer en masse. Roosevelt's aide wrote McKinley that our men represent every phase of American life. Ultra-fashionables from New York, men from the North, South, East, West, ranchmen, cowboys, miners, every profession, in fact, pretty much every variety of American manhood. And you can see that kind of depicted, this sort of jingoistic nationalism being depicted here in this painting. Now, an interesting side effect of the War of 1898, or the Spanish-American War, was that it served to kind of help further the reunion between the North and the South. It was just over a little over 30 years since the Civil War had ended. The nation was still healing. And war in Cuba gave Americans from the North and the South a common enemy to fight. Now, the U.S. Navy at this time was vastly superior to the Spanish, but the Army was not very well prepared. So the Spanish-American War is largely a naval war. On May 1st, Admiral Dewey ends up destroying Spanish ships in the Philippines at Manila. American troops invade Cuba in June, and the Spanish fleet attempting to escape was destroyed in Santiago Harbor. The Spanish end up surrendering on July 17th. And 1 week later, American troops take the island of Puerto Rico, with only 3 American lives lost. And we end up signing a peace treaty, an armistice with Spain on August 12th. Now, only 460 Americans in total were killed in battle in the Spanish-American War, but over 5,000 died of disease. And this kind of gives you an indication that the war was not really as splendid as John Hay had described. The soldiers in the Spanish-American War, they faced serious supply problems. America hadn't really prepared for war. There was a shortage of weapons and ammunition. They didn't have the right kind of uniforms. The medical services were inadequate. They had terrible food. Tropical diseases end up killing 5 times as many Americans as bullets. One soldier wrote, he said, "Words are inadequate to express the feeling of pain and sickness when one has the fever. some kind of tropical disease. For about a week, every bone in my body ached, and I did not care much whether I lived or not. The battles of the Spanish-American War were pretty bloody, even though not many people, not many Americans died. But it really wasn't as glorious as many people had thought. Most of the soldiers who were in the regular army, they didn't have a lot of experience with modern warfare. So the U.S. relied very heavily on National Guard units in the Spanish-American War, and a lot of these were commanded by local leaders who didn't have a lot of military experience. There were also a lot of racial tensions that kind of surfaced during the war. This picture on the bottom right here is a photograph of a segregated company of African-American soldiers. And there was a significant portion of the American invading force in Cuba who were African-American. Some of these were volunteer troops who were put together by black communities. Others were the members of the 4 black regiments in the regular army. And they, of course, were very sympathetic to the struggle of the Cuban people. One soldier wrote, "At last we have taken up the sword to enforce the divine rights of a people who have been unjustly treated." And as these black soldiers traveled through the South toward their training camps, they encountered a lot of segregation and occasional violence. And racial tensions continued in Cuba, where these black troops ended up winning many medals. Nearly half of the Cuban insurgents who they were fighting alongside were black, but they were fully integrated into the rebel army. And so you had this sight of black Cuban soldiers fighting alongside their white counterparts as equals. And this gives African Americans a much stronger sense of the injustice of their position. They were not allowed to fight with white soldiers. So now we have the problem of what are we going to do with Cuba? When Cuba draws up a constitution that makes no reference to the United States, Congress passes the Platt Amendment in 1901, which basically pressures Cuba to incorporate its terms into its constitution. This amendment bars Cuba from making international treaties, which basically gives the United States control over Cuban foreign policy. It gives the U.S. the right to intervene in Cuba to preserve its independence and the life and property of any Americans who are living there. And it requires Cuba to permit American naval stations. This is when we get Guantanamo Bay. And so what we start to see is that American investors begin to come flooding into Cuba. They begin buying up plantations, factories, railroads, refineries. And so you have this becoming, as we're going to see into the 20th century, the American ownership of these important resources is a source of a lot of resentment among the Cuban people. And this produces occasional revolts against the Cuban government and sometimes prompts the U.S. to intervene militarily. American troops end up going back into Cuba from 1906 to 1909, and they come back again in 1912 to put down a revolt by by black plantation workers. So this problem of governing Cuba is, as you can see in this cartoon here, a bigger job than he thought for. So America has now won the Spanish-American War. We've triumphed over Spain. Now this means the U.S. has to confront the problem of what to do with this newly acquired territory. So in 1898, we signed this treaty with Spain, and this gives the U.S. control over Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Now, Cuba and Puerto Rico, they were close by. They were close by to the mainland U.S., so this seemed to kind of fit comfortably with America's sense of itself as the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. But now we've also acquired the Philippines, which is thousands of miles away. And this is something that seems like an entirely different animal to many Americans. So there is a huge anti-imperialism sentiment that develops in the country. There's resistance to this idea of annexation is very fierce within Congress. And this powerful anti-imperialist movement arises to oppose the acquisition of the Philippines. Some of the nation's wealthiest and most influential figures, including people like Andrew Carnegie and Mark Twain, were anti-imperialists. And anti-imperialists, they had different arguments for why they didn't want to see America gain these new territories. Some believed that imperialism was immoral, that it was against American traditional values. Some feared the polluting of America's population by introducing inferior races into it. And you can see that depicted in this cartoon here on the left. And, that really kind of shows how, sort of these anti-imperialists are arguing that, sort of incorporating these people in, that they are, sort of not going to, be able to be assimilated or be able to be incorporated into the American fabric. Workers are afraid they're going to be undercut by cheap foreign labor. A lot of people are afraid this is going to mean that we have to create a large standing army. This is going to mean we have to, get involved in all kinds of entangling alliances. And so we have, concerns on a whole host of fronts that kind of unite these anti-imperialists together. They're also sort of, again, you have, so some of these concerns are, sort of racially motivated. Others are more idealistic. They believe that annexation would kind of repudiate America's commitment to human freedom. And as you can see from this cartoon on the right, this is basically arguing that we can't try to export our civilization when as it says here, civilization begins at home, and, we can't call ourselves civilized if we are not, kind of granting the same rights to, if we have all these problems of racial, sort of issues in the South. So annexation or anti-imperialists were a pretty varied group. But eventually the pro-annexationists or the pro-imperialists end up winning out. The Senate eventually ends up ratifying the treaty, allowing the U.S. to acquire these different territories abroad. So now this brings us to a little-known war in American history, the Filipino American War. American troops had been occupying the Philippines, and they quickly encountered local troops, the troops who were led by a man named Emilio Aguinaldo. He had led the fight of the Filipino people against Spain for independence in 1896 and 1897. Aguinaldo was a very brilliant military leader. He was ardently nationalistic. He said in a proclamation to his people, "All my efforts have been useless against the measureless pride of the American government and of its representatives in these islands who have treated me as a rebel because I defend the sacred interests of my country and do not make myself an instrument of their dastardly intentions." So initially, U.S. troops end up fighting alongside Aguinaldo's forces, but tension begins to grow as it becomes clear that the U.S. has no intention of withdrawing after its war with Spain. So these tensions that had been mounting end up exploding in February of 1899. And so we start to see this outbreak of hostilities, and what basically ensues is essentially a guerrilla war. And it's an extremely brutal war. Initially, American commanders, they believed that these rebels only had a very small popular following. But by early 1900, one of the generals writes, "I have been reluctantly compelled to believe that the Filipino masses are loyal to Aguinaldo and the government which he heads." And so there was a total of 126,000 American troops fighting in the Philippines during this conflict, which lasts about 3 years approximately. Over 4,000 Americans die in the Filipino American War. And the number of Filipino casualties is up for debate, but it's maybe as high as 200,000 died either in the war or through famine and disease caused by the destruction of the war. And there were atrocities committed on both sides as the war drags on and as the U.S. Army kind of fights from island to island. And gradually the American military effort becomes more systematically brutal. Most of the Filipino guerrillas who were captured were summarily executed. On some islands, entire villages were evacuated. Their residents were forced into concentration camps, while American troops destroyed villages, farms, crops, and the livestock. American forces also end up using torture on captured rebels, including the so-called water cure, which was something similar to waterboarding, as we know it today. So we get into this, sort of increasingly brutal war in the Philippines. We also are, expanding our interest in other parts of the Far East. China is a huge market with a lot of competition from European powers. And the U.S. had conducted a small but a very profitable trade with China throughout the 19th century. In 1844, there was a treaty that was signed between the Chinese and the U.S., and it pledged the so-called open door, which meant basically equal opportunity for Americans to come in and to trade with the Chinese. Now, the Europeans, mainly the British, the French, the Germans, and the Russians, and also the Japanese, they are also wanting to make their trade treaties with China. And so China gives them access to ports. They get these, kind of most favored nation trading privileges. And so they basically start to carve up different spheres of influence throughout the country. The U.S. wants to join in this competition. The U.S. wants to enlarge its share. We want a place to sell our surplus goods. And, of course, we have a large American missionary presence in China. So in 1899, Secretary of State John Hay, he issues the first of the so-called open door notes. Basically, what Hay is sort of arguing here is that he sends these notes out asking the European powers not to violate any existing agreements and not to discriminate against other nations when it comes to trade with China. And the Europeans reluctantly agree to this. Now, this new policy ends up being tested by the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. The Boxers were a society of these young, very idealistic, very traditionalistic Chinese students mainly, who were rebelling against the Chinese government, the Manchu dynasty, and also against Western influence. They were very much against any kind of, Western powers coming in and taking over their culture. And so they were very much motivated by these Western powers coming in and kind of carving up their country. So they end up targeting Christian missionaries and Westerners. They besiege part of the city of Peking. The U.S. joins the Europeans in sending troops to put down the Boxer Rebellion. We send about 3,000 troops to join this international army to put down the Boxers in China. The result of this is that now the U.S. has troops there, but so do the Europeans. The Europeans have a military presence in China, and this is a little bit threatening to America. So John Hay issues with the so-called second open door notes, which basically asks the Europeans to support Chinese territorial and administrative integrity. And the Europeans agree to this, and they end up pulling their troops out in 1901. So I think this cartoon is very interesting because here we have Uncle Sam. He's holding a large key, and it's a little hard to see, but on it is written the words American diplomacy. And he's standing in the open doorway to the potential riches of China. And we have all these other figures representing the other major world powers, Germany, France, Britain, Russia, probably Italy, maybe Japan or Austria, Hungary. They're waiting outside the gates to be let in. And the Chinese, if you can see behind them, they seem to be kind of happy that the Americans are protecting them from these other powers. And so this is this kind of idealized depiction of America's ambitions to control access to Chinese trade. Now, of course, there's a lot of racist assumptions in this picture as well. The idea that the U.S. should be the key holder for these people who are too weak to do it themselves. Now, of course, when the Chinese did fight back against foreign influences, like in the Boxer Rebellion, they're called savages. They're, put down. So we have, again, sort of these, kind of ideas about race coming in here, ideas about, U.S. dominance throughout the world, and, kind of tied up with American economic policy as well. Now, despite our interest in the Far East, most of U.S. economic expansion was concentrated in our traditional sphere of influence, which was the Western Hemisphere. And this brings us to the creation of so-called banana republics, and I don't mean the store here. It's a pejorative term for a small, often Latin American or Caribbean country which is politically unstable, usually dependent on agriculture, and ruled by a small, wealthy, and corrupt group. And this term was actually coined by O. Henry, who was an American humorist and short story writer. And he was talking specifically here about the nation of Honduras. Republic, in his time, was often a euphemism for a dictatorship, and sometimes it still is. And banana implies kind of a reliance on basic agriculture and sort of backwardness in developing modern industrial technology. So foreign investment abroad meant that what we start to see is that private American citizens end up controlling territory and infrastructure in lots of places throughout Latin America, countries like Costa Rica, Honduras, Nicaragua, Guatemala. They are basically controlled, or most of the land is held by Americans. And so an example of this, in Costa Rica, U.S. investors were led by a guy named Minor Keith. And he was the one who helped to create the railroad in Costa Rica beginning in 1873. This project took 19 years and cost hundreds of lives, including his two brothers actually ended up dying during this project. When Costa Rica defaulted on its loans for the railroad, they gave Minor Keith the ownership of the tracks and also 80,000 acres of land alongside the railroad tracks. And Keith turns around and he plants bananas here. And so he ends up making money by exporting bananas along those railroad tracks that he owns himself to the ports in the Atlantic. He ends up marrying the daughter of the former Costa Rican president. In 1883, he takes over the British land holdings in Costa Rica, and he receives 800,000 acres, which is about 7% of Costa Rica itself. And he is known as the uncrowned king of Central America. In 1899, Keith's company merged with another company called United Fruit, and they formed the largest banana company in the world. United Fruit and its subsidiaries soon owned mines, ranches, railways, ports, plantations, all throughout Latin America, in Colombia, Costa Rica, Cuba, Jamaica, Nicaragua, Panama. They also owned 11 steamships, which they called the Great White Fleet. And so you can see this, they're basically becoming kind of their own little mini empire here. And this is owned by American businessmen. This here on the top left is a pamphlet that was published by the United Fruit Company in 1928. And it's supposed to promote the consumption of bananas by Americans. Prior to 1870, you couldn't get a banana in the United States. The United Fruit Company controls 75% of banana sales in the U.S. And in 1883, you start to see bananas coming in. 110,000 bunches of bananas are exported. 7 years later, exports were over 1 million. In 1900, the number rose to 3.4 million. And by 1907, there were more than 10 million bunches of bananas being brought into the United States. Now, of course, remember that Alfred Thayer Mahan had called for U.S. naval supremacy. He had called for a canal that would connect the Atlantic and the Pacific, and that would be controlled by the U.S., and that was going to be a big part of that dominance. This would allow the U.S. easier trading access. We would be able to regulate who goes between the oceans. So in 1850, the U.S. signed a treaty with Britain, which said that the two countries would work together to build this canal. But the U.S. wasn't really interested in cooperating with anybody. We wanted our exclusive rights to control the canal. And so in 1879, a French company announced that it is going to build a Panamanian canal. The U.S. is not happy about this. We argue that the U.S. should control this, canal, and that, and people were saying either an American canal or no canal. So the U.S. ends up sending warships along the coast of Nicaragua and Panama in 1880 to kind of keep the French out of there. The U.S. continues to assert its rights in the region. The Navy intervenes in Panama on at least 7 occasions between 1846 and 1903 to protect America's interests. And eventually we do end up building the Panama Canal. So we start to see, sort of these investors calling upon the U.S. government to protect their interests, sometimes through the use of force. For example, we engineer a revolution in Panama in order to gain access to build the Panama Canal. Now, in 1900, McKinley he soundly defeated, as we talked about last time, he defeats the anti-imperialist William Jennings Bryan in the election. And this is seen as kind of a vindication of American imperialism and nationalism. After the Spanish-American War, Theodore Roosevelt had come back to the U.S. He had become the governor of New York. And then he was, sort of, they made him vice president. Now, he was partly made vice president because some people in the Republican Party thought that he was, becoming too influential. And so to eliminate his influence, or at least slow down his rise in the party, they make him vice president, which is a position that doesn't have a lot of power. But 6 months into McKinley's second term, McKinley is assassinated, and Roosevelt becomes president. And one party leader said, kind of lamenting, that damn cowboy is now president of the United States. So Roosevelt was a very interesting guy. He was a big advocate of physical fitness and also collective national strength. He had been very small and weak as a child, and he was very much influenced by these kind of social Darwinistic ideas about human life and nature as being kind of this constant struggle for survival. And so he believed in using American power in the world. He believed that a strong military was a sign of racial superiority and national greatness. He believed in the kind of differences between these so-called civilized and uncivilized nations. And when he becomes president, he ends up further consolidating his presidential power by really becoming a, sort of very, strong diplomat. He practiced a very personal style of diplomacy, and he, ends up kind of, becoming a very, sort of ardent expansionist. And he sets a pattern that is followed by nearly all 20th century presidents, as we're going to see. So he plays a very strong role in foreign affairs. All right, so that kind of brings us to the turn of the century, 1900. By 1900, the U.S. has now established itself as a major world power. We are exercising economic control. We're certainly exercising occasional political and military control over the Western Hemisphere. We have acquired the island territories of Hawaii and Guam and Puerto Rico and the Philippines. But the question is, what are we going to do with these newly gained territories? Are they colonies? Should they become states? Are these native peoples protected by the U.S. Constitution? In a series of cases decided in 1901, the so-called insular cases, the Supreme Court declares that the native peoples of Hawaii and Puerto Rico would achieve citizenship and constitutional rights only when Congress says that they are ready. The Philippines, as we've seen, they resisted American rule, but other areas did not, and the U.S. had to kind of work out a new sort of relationship to them. You have the islands of Hawaii and Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa, the Virgin Islands, all of these except being governed by the United States. But Congress is reluctant to treat them as territories that would eventually become states. And so Congress therefore kind of invents a new status, somewhere between colony and territory. And these cartoons kind of say a lot about the debate that Americans had over how to incorporate their newly acquired colonies. So I want you to kind of look at these cartoons for a bit, see what you can see what you notice about them, and if you kind of have any reaction to them, please do post it in the discussion board. I thought these were kind of interesting. And this issue of, sort of what to do with these territories that we have abroad is still, sort of a problem for us today. There's the island of Puerto Rico, which many people, after Hurricane Maria hit, many people didn't realize, but Puerto Ricans are officially considered American citizens, even though they don't have the right to vote in presidential elections. So we still have a lot of these kind of, ideas that are hanging over from this kind of early 20th century, late 19th and early 20th century imperialistic ideas about, can these people be incorporated into, full American life as citizens? And you would have thought that we would have, resolved this by now, but, that's something to write your congressperson about. All right, so what have we learned? So we've seen how technological changes, how economic uncertainty, and how ideology kind of work together to try to influence, or kind of come together to influence, America's rise as a world power. And we've seen how this, in turn, means that the government and military power is going to have to expand. And the kind of takeaway here is that through a promotional state and a powerful presidency, America begins in the late 19th and early 20th century to influence the rest of the world, economically, culturally, militarily, and politically. So if you have any questions about any of the stuff that we've talked about today, please do post it in the general questions forum. And I will, I'll be happy to answer any, sort of questions or, respond to any observations you might have. All right, have a great week, everybody.